At our family's luxury Christmas dinner, laughter sparkled louder than the chandelier light. Ethan leaned back in his velvet chair, the picture of corporate confidence swirling a glass of Bordeaux that probably cost more than my rent used to. "Still job hunting, Nat," he said loud enough for the entire dining hall to hear. Dad chuckled, carving the roast. "You used to be so ambitious, Nat. What happened to that fire?" The table erupted in laughter. Mom Vanessa, even our cousin Luke. Everyone except me. I smiled, placed my napkin carefully beside my plate, and then I spoke the words I'd rehearsed for months. Funny, because the loser you're laughing at signs your paychecks and owns 70% of your company. The room went silent, just the crackling of the fireplace left between us. But maybe I should start before that moment, before the silence and the stares, when I was still playing the role they'd written for me. Christmas at the Pierce mansion was less a celebration and more a performance. Every year, Dad staged it like a corporate gala, silver cutlery, imported wines, a guest list, handpicked for networking value. Mom fussed over the floral arrangements Vanessa pretended for photos, and Ethan treated the night like his annual press conference. I was the supporting act, the creative but unstable younger daughter, whose only purpose was to fill an empty seat and make the family look complete. The scent of pine and truffle butter filled the house when I arrived. Maggie, the housekeeper who'd raised me more than my parents ever did, opened the door. Her eyes softened. "You look lovely, Miss Natalie," she whispered, and I could tell she meant it. The others wouldn't notice. Not the emerald dress, not the restraint in my makeup, not the composure I'd rehearsed. They'd only see what they wanted to see, a failure hiding behind polite smiles. "Nat, you're here." Vanessa's voice sliced through the air like champagne fizz. She hugged me with the warmth of a handshake, careful not to smudge her lipstick. "You didn't bring anyone again. You should really try dating apps. Ethan has a friend at Goldman who's—" "I'm good," I said, easing away. The superficiality was already setting in a thick, suffocating layer. Ethan emerged from the parlor phone in one hand, glass in the other, tailored suit glinting under the fairy lights. "Still freelancing?" he asked. The word freelancing rolled off his tongue like an insult, a clear dismissal of any work that didn't involve a corner office. "Or are you back to your charity phase?" "Consulting," I said simply. My voice was low, deliberately quiet. "Let them underestimate me." He grinned, the kind of grin that always made me want to leave the room. "Consulting. Right. That's what people say when they're unemployed, but don't want to admit it." Dad laughed from across the room, the sound deep and dismissive. "You have to hand it to her, Ethan. At least she's consistent. No job, no husband, no mortgage." Mom sighed in faux sympathy, adjusting a pearl necklace. "Don't be cruel. Natalie has potential." Potential. That word they used like a leash, keeping me close enough to control, yet far enough away to dismiss. I bit the inside of my cheek and smiled, a brittle, dangerous smile that didn't reach my eyes. Because tonight, potential would no longer be a promise, it would be proof. Dinner was served at 8 sharp, the table long enough to seat a minor royal family. Crystal stemware glimmered beside porcelain plates embossed with the Pierce crest. Ethan sat at the head, of course, presiding over the meal like a king. Dad to his right, Vanessa to his left. I was at the far end near the fireplace, an appropriate place for the family's embarrassment, close enough to watch, far enough to be ignored. I felt the heat from the logs on my back, a warmth that was the only honest comfort in the room. Ethan tapped his glass for attention, silencing the chatter. "Before we toast, I want to thank everyone for supporting Pierce Holdings this year. Our expansion into green energy was a massive success. Revenues up 40%. 42, Vanessa corrected, beaming like she'd earned it. I nodded politely. I could have told them the exact figure, 42.6, because I'd read every line of their quarterly report before signing off on it 2 weeks ago. But they didn't know that, not yet. Dad raised his glass. "To Ethan, our pride, our legacy." They toasted. Glasses clinked. I sipped my water and watched them drink to my investment. The irony was almost intoxicating. Nat Ethan called down the table. "When are you going to do something that makes Mom and Dad proud?" I smiled thinly. "I thought I already did." He laughed, oblivious. Oh, right, that little art project of yours. What's it called again? The blog about, women in business cute. It's called The Phoenix Report, I said, voice steady. It's doing well. It funded my consulting firm. Vanessa giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. Sweetheart, everything does well when it's a hobby. Dad's chuckle followed hers. We're just teasing Nat. You know we love you. Love. Another word they used like a sedative, a way to numb the sting of their constant belittling. The conversation rolled on a blur of brand names, mergers, and golf anecdotes. I stared at the chandelier, each crystal prism scattering light like fragments of a truth they couldn't see. The opulence of the room felt like a cage, and I was holding the key. My hand brushed the envelope in my clutch. The legal transfer confirming my 70% ownership of Pierce Holdings through Evercrest Capital. My pulse thrummed against it, steady, certain. The paper felt like power itself. When dessert arrived, a showpiece chocolate soufflé crafted by the chef Ethan had flown in from New York, the teasing returned sharper this time. They saw I wasn't reacting, and they pressed harder for a reaction. So Natalie, Ethan said, his voice lilting with smug amusement. Still job hunting. Maybe next year we'll put your resume in the company newsletter. We could even list your blog as experience. Laughter erupted again. Dad joined in, shaking his head like this was all harmless fun. At your age and still no stable job, he said, his voice laced with genuine disappointment that cut deeper than Ethan's sarcasm. You used to be so ambitious. What happened, honey? The word honey stung worse than the laughter. It was the condescending final note. Something inside me, the ambition they thought was dead, the potential they'd shackled, finally snapped. I set down my water glass, the delicate clink cutting through the noise. I took a deep, steadying breath. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I just smiled, looked directly at my father, then across the table at my brother, and delivered the line that changed everything, funny. Because the loser you're laughing at signs your paychecks and owns 70% of your company. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and delicious. The game was over. The house smelled like cinnamon and old money that morning. I woke up to the sound of sleet tapping against my bedroom window, and Boston winter pressing cold fingers against the glass. Downstairs, I could already hear my mother's voice barking orders at the catering staff. No, not that centerpiece, the red orchids, not the white. We're not hosting a funeral. Christmas at the Pierce mansion was always choreographed chaos. Elegant on the surface, cruel underneath. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair into place, wondering why I still came back every year. Maybe because part of me still hoped they'd see me. Not as the disappointment who walked away from a 6-figure banking job, but as the daughter who'd kept the family together when everything was falling apart. The smell of freshly baked croissants drifted from the kitchen as I walked downstairs. Mom stood in her silk robe, diamonds catching the morning light like small, cold stars. She turned, assessing me the way she used to assess the staff. Oh, you're up early. You didn't have to come this soon, Natalie. I thought I'd help, I said, reaching for a tray of gingerbread cookies. She frowned, adjusting a crystal vase. Just don't overdo it. Vanessa's catering the desserts. We don't want any overlap. Overlap. That was her way of saying don't outshine your brother's wife. I nodded, pretending not to notice the insult. Of course, Mom. She softened for a moment, maybe out of guilt. You know, if you'd stayed in finance, you'd be Ethan's equal by now. I didn't leave because I couldn't handle it, I said quietly. I left because someone had to take care of you when you had your stroke. The crystal vase slipped slightly in her hand before she steadied it. We've thanked you for that. You sent me a fruit basket, I wanted to say. Instead, I smiled. Yes, you did. After breakfast, I walked through the snow-dusted garden past the marble fountain Dad had imported from Italy the year Ethan made partner. The statue at the center, a triumphant man holding a laurel wreath, always felt like a shrine to him. Dad's golden boy. I still remembered the day everything changed. 7 years ago, the family business Pierce Holdings was weeks from collapse. Ethan had just been promoted to CEO after Dad's retirement. Bad loans, poor acquisitions, The usual cocktail of arrogance and negligence had driven the company toward bankruptcy. The crisis hit the same year Mom's health failed. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and never looked back. I thought I'd be gone for a month. It has been 7 years. And while I sat by my mother's bedside, Ethan rebuilt the company. At least that's what everyone believed. In truth, I was the one who saved it. I used the life insurance trust Dad had set up for me, and working through legal proxies, I founded Evercrest Capital. The mission was simple: acquire controlling interest in Pierce Holdings, quietly turning debt into equity. Ethan claimed he'd secured outside investors to rescue the business. But I was the outside investor. The irony was delicious. Ethan strutted around Boston like a savior, giving interviews claiming the Pierce legacy. Meanwhile, I was the one approving his quarterly budgets through shell companies. But secrecy has a cost. I spent years playing invisible. The lawyers called it strategic anonymity. I called it survival. My phone buzzed as I reached the terrace. A new email notification glowed on the screen: Victoria Hale, Evercrest Capital. The subject line read, Pierce Holdings Q4 Summary. I opened it. Performance 47% above projection. Ownership consolidated to 70% controlling interest. Action required. Board transition scheduled. Legal authority confirmed. Victoria's note followed. Everything's ready, Natalie. Once you sign, Ethan's no longer CEO. We can execute quietly or publicly. Your call. My reflection stared back from the screen. Quietly or publicly. Inside, Mom was fussing over the silverware again, humming carols. Upstairs, Dad's voice thundered on a phone call, confident, arrogant, unshakable. For years, he'd built his power on the assumption that I had none. I typed back one sentence, publicly. At dinner. The phone vibrated seconds later with her reply. Understood. Merry Christmas, Natalie. The words felt heavier than they should. I spent the afternoon helping Maggie arrange the dining room. She'd been with our family for 30 years, and in her quiet way, she'd seen everything. She noticed the tension I tried to hide. Are you sure you want to do this tonight? She asked softly, laying out silver napkin rings. Yes, I said. I'm tired of pretending. She nodded, smoothing the tablecloth. Your father used to say pride runs deep in this house. Be careful, Miss Natalie. Pride doesn't like being challenged. I'm counting on it. Evening crept slowly and golden. The house glowed with 1,000 fairy lights, carol music drifting through the halls. Guests began arriving, business partners, family friends, old board members. The same faces who'd once patted me on the shoulder and said, Don't worry, sweetheart. Not everyone's meant for business. As I dressed for the dinner, I chose the emerald gown deliberately. It was the same color as the company logo, Pierce Holdings, Inc., a private joke I'd waited years to share. I slipped the Evercrest signet ring onto my finger, the only outward symbol of what I truly owned. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not the unemployed sister, not the family disappointment, but the quiet force that had built an empire while everyone else was busy laughing. Maggie appeared in the doorway. They're waiting for you, Miss Natalie. I took one last look at the snow swirling outside, gathering my breath. The Pierce mansion shimmered like a cathedral of illusions. But tonight, the lights would go out, at least for them. Then let's give them a Christmas they'll never forget. And with that, I walked downstairs, heels clicking against marble, ready to take back everything they'd stolen from me. Dinner hadn't started yet, but the house was already filled with performance. My family didn't gather. They staged themselves. Ethan held court in the sitting room, framed by the glow of the fireplace like a magazine, spread his arms slung casually around Vanessa's waist, his Rolex catching the light. He was telling some story about a new acquisition, his audience of uncles and old family friends, laughing at all the right places. When he saw me in the doorway, his smile faltered for half a second, then returned wider and sharper. Ah, the prodigal sister, he announced. Back from her artistic sabbatical. The room chuckled. I forced a smile. Good to see you too, Ethan. Dad stood near the bar, whiskey in hand, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn for the past 3 Christmases, old money pretending to be timeless. You look nice, sweetheart, he said. Did you finally decide to dress up for once? Mom shot him a warning glance. Robert, she murmured. Then to me. Your hair looks beautiful, darling. Just maybe a little too dramatic for the evening, I wanted to laugh. For them, everything about me was always too much. Too opinionated. Too ambitious. Too visible. I crossed the room, poured myself a glass of red, and stood near the window overlooking the frozen gardens. The conversation flowed around me, the same predictable rhythm: business, stocks, real estate, politics. No one asked about my life, and I didn't offer. Silence was safer. Vanessa approached, her perfume sweet and calculated. So Natalie, she began, her smile tight. Still living in that little apartment downtown? Yes, I said. Still fits me better than a mansion full of people pretending to like each other. Her smile twitched. Oh, you're funny. Ethan says you could do so well if you just focused. You were always so bright in school. Remember how everyone said you were the smart one? I remember, I said, sipping my wine. Ethan reminds me every Christmas that it didn't matter. Vanessa blinked, unsure how to respond. She settled for adjusting her diamond bracelet. He worries about you, you know. He wants you to find your path. I smiled thinly. Don't worry. I found it. He just doesn't know he's standing on it. From across the room, Ethan's laughter rose again. Remember the Pierce Holdings anniversary party, he was saying to one of Dad's old associates? We almost lost the company before I turned it around. Can you imagine? That was the defining moment of my career. Ah, yes, the man said. You brought in that mystery investor, didn't you? Saved the whole thing. Ethan puffed his chest, clearly enjoying himself. Evercrest Capital. Brilliant firm. They had faith in me when no one else did. I raised my glass toward him, whispering under my breath, You're welcome. Dad's voice cut through the chatter. Come, everyone. Let's move to the dining hall. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath a canopy of golden light. Place cards marked the hierarchy. Ethan at the head. Mom to his right, Dad to his left. I was seated near the end again beside Aunt Marjorie, who smelled like Chanel and disapproval. As the first course arrived, Dad began his usual monologue about family legacy. Your grandfather built Pierce Holdings with his bare hands, he said, tapping the table for emphasis. He believed in hard work, loyalty, and passing down something of value. He looked at Ethan, pride in his eyes. And you, son, you've honored that legacy. Ethan smiled modestly, or tried to. I've had good mentors, Dad. The compliment wasn't for me. It never was. Aunt Marjorie leaned toward me. And what do you do these days, dear? Still, writing consulting, I said. Her eyes lit with false interest. Oh, lovely. For what kind of company? Several. I said, letting the vagueness hang. Dad chuckled from down the table. She's been very secretive lately, hasn't she? Maybe she's consulting Santa Claus. More laughter. I joined in this time, just enough to keep the peace. Inside, my pulse was steady, calm, controlled. The second course arrived, lobster bisque served in crystal bowls. Conversation shifted to company gossip. Ethan bragged about landing a deal with a renewable energy firm in Seattle. Vanessa added color commentary like a PR assistant. Evercrest will be thrilled, one guest said. They've profited handsomely since they joined your board. Evercrest is more than an investor, Ethan said, smirking. They're partners. Anonymous geniuses, whoever they are. I set down my spoon before it shook. The irony almost made me laugh. Mom clinked her glass for attention. Let's not bore poor Natalie with business talk, she said sweetly. She's more into creative pursuits. Aren't you, dear? I like creating things that last, I said. That's business too, in a way. Dad nodded, not really listening. You know, Natalie, your brother's company could use someone like you once you decide to settle down and get serious. Ethan grinned. Oh, I'd hire her in a second. Maybe as a consultant. She's got potential. That word again. Potential. Like a carrot on a stick dangled forever just out of reach. I forced a laugh. Thanks, but I'm doing all right. Ethan leaned back, sipping his wine. Doing what exactly? Before I could answer, Mom stepped in. Ethan, stop teasing your sister. He waved her off. It's just conversation. She can take a joke. Yes, I said softly. I've taken plenty. He didn't hear the edge in my tone, or maybe he did and mistook it for surrender. Dessert was served cranberry tart with sugared rosemary. The air was thick with wine and family pride. Dad began another toast praising Ethan's vision and leadership, while Mom dabbed tears from her eyes. As they clinked glasses, I glanced around the table. The faces glowed in candlelight. Ethan's smug satisfaction, Dad's nostalgic pride, Mom's brittle smile, Vanessa's quiet triumph. They thought this was the peak of their story. They had no idea they were already standing on my mountain. When the plates were cleared and the music swelled softly from the speakers, I excused myself, stepping onto the terrace. Snow was falling hard now, soft and relentless. I breathed in the cold, the air sharp and clean after the suffocating warmth inside. Behind me, their laughter echoed through the glass. Inside, they were celebrating themselves. Outside, I was preparing to end the celebration forever. I took out my phone. A message from Victoria glowed on the screen, documents delivered. Effective midnight, your chair of the board. Shall I notify the press or keep it internal? I typed back one word. Neither. Then after a pause added, they'll find out from me. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and looked through the frosted window at my family, so polished, so sure. Tomorrow their pride would crack like thin ice. But tonight, I would let them laugh one last time. The first time I saw the name Evercrest Capital printed on a legal document, I felt like I was watching someone else's life begin. It was 6 years ago in a cramped, downtown Boston office that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. The attorney across from me, a young woman named Victoria Hale, slid a thick stack of papers across the table and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Pierce. You just became an investor." I wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that office, not in that world, not after I'd walked away from my career to care for my mother while Ethan built his empire. But grief has a way of clearing illusions. After Dad's highly publicized retirement, when the new company structure was announced, I learned the truth: Ethan had inherited the majority of voting shares. I got nothing. My inheritance was instead sealed in a life insurance trust only accessible for educational or emergency purposes. Your creative, Dad had said in the accompanying letter. Not a business mind. He was wrong. Victoria had been my father's estate lawyer before she became my secret weapon. I'd shown her the life insurance payout, the one he thought I'd never use responsibly, and asked one question: can I make it grow without anyone knowing it's mine? She'd smiled like a woman who'd been waiting to hear those exact words. We started small. The first investment was in a chain of medical supply startups that had fallen off Ethan's acquisition list. I learned fast. Numbers were language, patterns were rhythm, and strategy was art. By the end of the first year, Evercrest Capital had a portfolio of quiet power companies no one noticed until they were indispensable. Then Pierce Holdings began to sink. Ethan blamed market conditions. The truth was simpler arrogance and overspending. He'd expanded too quickly, invested in bad tech, signed contracts that bled money. When the company's bonds were downgraded to junk, he called it temporary volatility. I called it an opportunity. Through shell companies and intermediaries, I began buying the debt, one transaction at a time. A few $100,000 here, a few million there. The name Evercrest appeared in ledgers like a ghost, never attached to mine. Ethan never questioned it. Why would he? He thought I was home baking cookies for Mom. Within 2 years, Evercrest held enough bonds to influence corporate decisions. When the board panicked and voted to restructure, Victoria executed the conversion debt to equity. Ownership. Majority control will trigger visibility thresholds, she'd warned. If anyone investigates, they'll see it's you. Then we stopped just short of that, I said. For now. For the next 3 years, I built my empire from a study overlooking a quiet street in Cambridge. By day, I ran small consulting gigs, design work, content strategy, whatever kept up the illusion. By night, I built a financial fortress. Each time Ethan boasted about his turnaround, I smiled privately. He was running on my oxygen breathing in my money, claiming my air as his own. The first time I saw his face on Forbes, the visionary behind Pierce Holdings, I laughed so hard I cried. The photo showed him standing in front of the new headquarters, the company's logo gleaming behind him, a stylized emerald pea, surrounded by a laurel wreath. The same logo I'd approved as part of the rebranding budget. Vanessa had shared the article on every platform, tagging herself as #blessed. Mom printed it and framed it. Dad, of course, toasted it with his best scotch. No one thought to ask who funded the miracle. I kept my distance, but I watched. Quarterly reports crossed my desk at Evercrest, coded under aliases reviewed line by line. Every new initiative, every new success story traced back to money I'd placed, guidance I'd approved, and risk I'd shouldered. The deal that changed everything came a year later. Pierce Holdings was negotiating with a European logistics firm, Aurora Freight, for a merger that would double their valuation. Ethan needed liquidity to seal the deal. He approached Evercrest Capital through intermediaries. Victoria called me, her tone halfway between amusement and awe. "Your brother wants to borrow from you." I smiled. "Then lend it to him. Market rate." "And the collateral, his company," I said. The documents were signed 2 weeks later. Ethan never met the Evercrest representative. He didn't need to. As far as he was concerned, the fund was run by a group of silent investors in New York. When the merger succeeded, his stock price soared. So did mine. By the time the board updated its records, I owned 70% of Pierce Holdings through proxies, trusts, and subsidiaries nested so deep, it would take a forensic accountant months to unwind. Victoria sent me a message that night. "Congratulations. You now control your family's empire. No one even knows." I stared at the screen for a long time. Control. Such a simple word. Then I typed back, "Not yet, but they will." The morning of the dinner arrived quiet and white, the kind of cold that makes everything sound softer. Outside, snow blanketed the Pierce estate like an apology that came too late. Inside, chaos had already begun. Caterers rushed through the halls with trays, decorators adjusted garlands, and my mother's voice carried from the dining room like a conductor commanding an orchestra. "Keep the gold ribbons symmetrical, Vanessa darling. Make sure the candles are unscented this year. Last time your father sneezed through the entire main course." I stood at the edge of the foyer, watching the ballet of perfection unfold. This was how my family handled everything: control the setting, polish the image, hide the cracks. Mom spotted me. "Natalie, finally, you should have come down earlier. There's so much to do. The florist delivered the wrong color roses, and the chef insists on plating in silver instead of porcelain." "Good morning to you too, Mom," I said. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, still beautiful in that brittle camera-ready way. "You didn't forget your dress, did you? Please tell me it's not something loud. Remember Vanessa's wearing gold?" "It's green," I said. "Dark emerald." She hesitated. Try not to stand too close to her in photos." "Of course. Heaven forbid I ruin the illusion of harmony." After breakfast, I escaped to the conservatory, where Maggie was trimming poinsettias. She'd worked for our family longer than anyone, her hands lined with years of quiet service. She looked up as I entered, eyes knowing. "Are you ready for tonight?" "As ready as I'll ever be." She snipped a stem, not looking at me. "Your father used to say Christmas shows who people really are. All the masks fall off by dessert. Then I suppose I'll give them a show worth remembering." Maggie smiled faintly. "Are you sure you want to do it this way?" "Yes," I said, my voice calm. "I've played invisible long enough." She set the shears down. "Then make sure you walk out taller than they do, not smaller." "I intend to." By noon, the house smelled of roasted rosemary and champagne. The chef shouted orders from the kitchen. Crystal clinked as the table was set, and Ethan's voice carried down the hall as he greeted early guests. "Welcome, welcome. Can't believe the market bounced back that fast, right? Pierce Holdings is ending the year strong." I caught a glimpse of him through the doorway. Tailored suit, watch, gleaming his confidence, effortless. He moved like a man who believed the world owed him applause. The phone in my clutch buzzed. It was Victoria. "Victoria, everything's in place. The board has confirmed the authority transfer. Once you sign, you're officially chairwoman. Me. Do it after the toast. Victoria publicly. Me. Yes. They'll hear it from me. I slipped the phone away just as Mom called out, "Natalie, can you please check on the dessert arrangements? The pastry chef says we're short on gold dust." I walked into the kitchen where chaos reigned, chefs moving in coordinated panic timers, beeping steam rising. Vanessa stood in the center like she owned the place, arranging macarons on a glass tower. "Perfect timing," she chirped. "Can you help polish these plates? They smudged during plating." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me to clean dishes during my brother's Christmas dinner?" She blinked, confused by my tone. "Oh, don't be dramatic. We're all pitching in. Besides, you're so good at detail work." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "You know, Vanessa, it's funny. For someone who calls me lazy every holiday, you sure rely on me to fix your mistakes." Her mouth opened, then shut. "I didn't mean," "I know," I said, smiling. "You never do." I left her standing there, surrounded by gold dust and discomfort. Upstairs, I laid out my dress on the bed, the emerald satin that shimmered like midnight glass. It wasn't new, but it looked powerful. I paired it with black heels and the Evercrest signet ring, its silver crest catching the light. As I dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My pulse was steady, my shoulders square. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own home. At 6:30, the first wave of guests arrived: business associates, old family friends, and enough donors to fill a political fundraiser. The Pierce mansion transformed into a spectacle of wealth and performance. Laughter floated through the corridors, glasses clinked, and the grand piano in the parlor played soft jazz. Mom glided through the room, all smiles and sequins. "Natalie, darling, come stand with us for the family photo." Ethan stood beside her, his arm around Vanessa, both glowing like the cover of a lifestyle magazine. I took my place at the edge, my smile polite, my distance deliberate. The photographer counted down. 3, 2, 1. The flash went off, freezing the tableau forever, the perfect family, all pretense and polish moments before it shattered. After the photo, I slipped away to study. The fire crackled softly as I sat at Dad's old desk. The smell of cedar and whiskey lingered just like him. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. "You'll never understand business, Natalie. You're too emotional." Maybe I was. But tonight, I wasn't acting from emotion. I was executing a plan. On the desk lay the board packet Victoria had couriered earlier that day, Pierce Holdings' annual governance update. My name was listed as majority shareholder and chairwoman of the board. Seeing it in print made something inside me settle like a door finally closing. A knock interrupted my thoughts. It was Maggie. She peeked in holding a small silver tray. "I thought you might need this." On the tray sat a glass of champagne and a folded napkin. Inside the napkin, a small handwritten note. "For courage." I smiled. "Thank you, Maggie." She nodded once. "It's almost time." By the time I returned to the dining hall, the table glittered with candlelight. Guests were seated, servers gliding in perfect rhythm. Ethan stood at the head, already mid-story, recounting another brilliant deal. I took my seat near the end just as Mom lifted her glass. "To my family," she said. "To success," Ethan added, smirking. To tell the truth, I murmured, barely audible. They didn't hear me. Not yet. Dessert was served, a towering chocolate centerpiece shaped like a crown. Everyone applauded. Ethan clinked his glass. "Before we dig in, I just want to say how proud I am of this family. Pierce Holdings is stronger than ever. Next year will be even bigger." Applause followed, polite and practiced. Then his eyes landed on me. "What about you, Nat? Got any big plans for the new year? Maybe a steady job this time?" Laughter rippled around the table. Even Dad chuckled. I smiled, tracing the rim of my glass. "Actually, yes," I said. "Tonight, in fact." Ethan grinned, assuming I was joking. "Oh, yeah, what's that?" I looked up, meeting his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." Something in my tone made Vanessa glance at me uneasily. I lifted my glass. "To my family," I said. and to new beginnings. The crystal chimed as I set the glass down. Midnight was still hours away, but my reckoning had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. The dinner had reached that strange point where the wine ran freer than good sense. Laughter rolled down the long table in waves, too loud, too forced, everyone pretending this was joy and not performance. Ethan was in his element, animated, smug, basking in attention like it was oxygen. Still job hunting, Nat. He called down the table, his voice carrying easily over the jazz playing in the background. Forks paused mid-air. The sentence hung there like a spark looking for dry kindling. I smiled without looking up. Define job hunting. Dad chuckled from his seat beside him, cutting into his roast. At your age and still no stable job, sweetheart. You were always our dreamer. Mom gave a nervous laugh. Robert, please. No, it's fine, I said, keeping my tone light. I like being underestimated. Ethan leaned forward, clearly delighted. You hear that, everyone? She likes it. See, Nat's the free spirit of the family, always chasing projects, never profits. Vanessa's laughter rang too sharp. Oh, Ethan, stop teasing her. She's fine, he said, waving her off. We all know Nat's allergic to commitment. She changes hobbies faster than I change watches. A few of the guests chuckled. One of Ethan's investors, a balding man with a forced smile, added, At least she's keeping things interesting. The laughter that followed was like broken glass. I took a slow sip of champagne, letting the bubbles burn against the back of my throat. For a moment I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the heater and the soft clink of crystal against china. The same kind of silence that used to fill my childhood when my father spoke, and we all had to pretend his words were wisdom, not cruelty. Then I smiled. Not the fragile, polite kind they were used to. The slow, deliberate kind that meant I'd decided something. Interesting, I said softly, setting my glass down. That's one word for it. Ethan grinned, oblivious. Come on, Nat. Don't be sensitive. We're just kidding. It's family. Right, I said. Family. Mom shifted uncomfortably. Let's move on, shall we? We have dessert. But Ethan was enjoying himself too much. No, I'm serious. Nat, tell us, what do you actually do these days? We've been wondering if you're secretly a spy or something. More laughter. Dad leaned back, smirking. Wouldn't that be something, my daughter, the spy who couldn't hold a real job? I looked at him, then really looked. The man who'd spent my entire life measuring success in dollars and obedience. The man who'd taught Ethan to value image over integrity. I wondered if he could feel what was coming. You want to know what I do? I asked quietly. Ethan raised his glass. Enlighten us. I leaned back in my chair, the emerald fabric of my dress catching the candlelight. I sign your paychecks. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It tripped, staggered, then died mid-breath. Forks froze. The air shifted. Ethan blinked. What? I smiled. You heard me. Every 2 weeks, that direct deposit you get, it comes from me. Dad frowned, confused. What kind of nonsense? It's not nonsense, I said, my voice clear now. Pierce Holdings' payroll system runs through Evercrest Capital's funding division. I own Evercrest. Vanessa's hand went to her throat. That can't be. Evercrest is a private equity firm I finished for her. One that started buying your company's debt 6 years ago, when Pierce Holdings was circling bankruptcy. Ethan's face was drained of color. That's impossible. Evercrest was an anonymous investor group. Yes, that's what you told the press. I picked up my glass again, swirling the champagne. But I suppose the truth never fits as neatly into your press releases. Mom whispered, Natalie, what are you saying? I'm saying, I said, standing slowly, that I own 70% of Pierce Holdings. The company Dad built. The company Ethan nearly destroyed. The company I saved. Silence. Even the jazz had stopped, the playlist ending at the worst possible moment. Dad's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. This is absurd. You don't have that kind of money. I didn't. I agreed. Until I used Dad's insurance payout to start a firm. You remember, Mom, the $2 million you said I should put into a trust? I put it into Evercrest instead. Mom's hand went to her mouth. You, I bought the company's bonds at 20 cents on the dollar, I continued. Converted them to equity when the market crashed. The board approved it. You even signed the minutes, Ethan. You just didn't bother reading them. Ethan's face was a study in disbelief and fury. You think this is funny? You're lying. I took my phone from my clutch and tapped the screen. The projector mounted near the bar flickered to life, connecting wirelessly. The company's shareholder summary appeared on the wall, glowing in sharp black and white. Pierce Holdings, Inc., ownership distribution as of Q4, Evercrest Capital, LLC, 70%. Underneath in smaller print, Managing Director Natalie Pierce. Gasps rippled around the table. Someone dropped a fork. Dad stared at the screen, his voice low and dangerous. You humiliated your family. On Christmas. I turned to him. No, Dad. You humiliated me every Christmas for 10 years. Tonight, I just returned the favor. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. You've been spying on me. Manipulating everything behind my back. I've been protecting what you took for granted, I said. Every time you called yourself a self-made man, every time you bragged about saving the company, you were standing on my money. Vanessa's voice shook. You can't just take everything from him. I'm not taking anything, I said, my tone even. It already belonged to me. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing long shadows across the table. Then Ethan stood trembling. You think this makes you powerful? You're still nothing without this family. I smiled. Then it's a good thing I own it. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes rooms. Dad sank back into his chair. Mom looked down, her hand trembling against her wine glass. The guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch. Finally, I set my glass down, my voice calm. Merry Christmas, everyone. And then, without waiting for a response, I walked out of the dining hall. The laughter, the arrogance, the years of belittlement, all of it stayed behind me, echoing faintly like ghosts fading in an empty house. Outside, snow drifted softly through the night. I stepped into it, breathing deep, my heels sinking into the white. Somewhere behind me, I heard Ethan's voice break into a shout muffled by the walls. But for the first time in years, I didn't flinch. Because the woman they'd called a failure had just signed their future. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire dining room had turned to stone. The fire snapped once, a single spark leaping upward, and then even that sound seemed to vanish. All I could hear was my own breathing, slow, steady, unshaken. Ethan's fork hit the floor first, the tiny clatter echoing like a gunshot. His face had gone completely still, as if his brain refused to process what he'd just heard. This is a joke, he said finally, his voice trembling with forced laughter. You're drunk, Nat. You've had too much champagne. I took a slow sip from my glass. Actually, I've had exactly enough. Dad's chair scraped against the marble floor. Enough of this nonsense, he snapped. You've embarrassed yourself and your family. Sit down before you make it worse. Worse, I repeated softly. You mean worse than being treated like the family disappointment for a decade? Worse than watching my brother steal credit for the company I built? Ethan slammed his hand on the table. You didn't build anything. You don't even work there. I smiled. No, I just own it. Vanessa gasped. You're bluffing. I turned my phone toward her, the screen displaying a signed SEC filing from that very morning. My name glowed in sharp digital certainty. Natalie Pierce, majority shareholder, 70%. Her mouth fell open. Ethan reached for the phone, but I pulled it back. Careful, I said. It's public record now. You can look it up after dessert. Dad's jaw clenched. You think money gives you power over your own family? You've lost your mind. I met his eyes evenly. No, Dad. I finally found it. Mom's hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass. Natalie, sweetheart, this can't be true. You've always said you didn't care about the company. I didn't, I said, until you all made it very clear that the only thing that mattered in this family was power. So I learned how to get it. Across the table, one of Ethan's investors whispered something to his wife. Another guest checked at his phone under the table, probably verifying my claim. A minute later, his eyes widened. He looked at Ethan, then at me, and slowly set the phone down. "It's true," he muttered. The room shifted. You could feel it, the slow, dawning realization that everything they thought they knew had just collapsed. Ethan's face flushed red. "You think this makes you some kind of hero? You humiliated me in front of our family, our investors, everyone. You did that yourself," I said, my voice low but sharp. "When you mocked me, when you laughed, when you turned my silence into your stage. Tonight, I just turned the lights back on." Dad pushed back from the table, his temper flaring. "Enough, I won't have my children tearing each other apart over a company." I turned to him. "You built that company on hierarchy, Dad. You decided one child was worth more than the other. This isn't about the company, it's about what you created." For the first time, his voice faltered. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect you, by making sure I never believed I was capable of more." He looked down at his plate, silent. Ethan was shaking now, his fists clenched, his voice cracking between rage and disbelief. "You don't even know what running a company takes. You've never managed people, I've managed you for 6 years, I interrupted. "You just didn't know it." A murmur spread across the table. Mom stood suddenly, her composure fracturing. "Stop it, both of you. This is Christmas." I turned to her, and for the first time that night my voice softened. "Mom, Christmas is supposed to mean forgiveness, right? Then maybe this is my version of it. Forgiving myself for ever thinking I wasn't enough." The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, dense, filled with the weight of realization. Then Ethan's voice broke it. "You can't fire me." I raised an eyebrow. "Watch me." He went pale. "You wouldn't dare." I reached for my clutch, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Board meeting notice. Effective tomorrow morning, Pierce Holdings will be restructuring. The board has already approved it." I slid the envelope across the table toward him. "You're officially on administrative leave pending an internal audit." Vanessa's breath caught. "An audit?" "Yes," I said. "To determine how much of the company's funds went toward your vacations, your luxury cars, and your fake charity events." Ethan shot to his feet. "You vindictive little—" "Sit down," I said quietly. Something in my tone stopped him. He sank back into his chair, breathing hard. Mom began to cry quietly. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, I picked up my glass again and raised it slightly. "To tell the truth," I said. "And to the women who build empires while everyone's too busy underestimating them to notice." No one joined the toast. I drained the glass, set it down, and turned toward the doorway. As I reached it, Ethan's voice followed me, raw and desperate. "You'll regret this, Nat. You've ruined everything." I paused, looking back at him over my shoulder. "No, Ethan. I just revealed what was already broken." Then I walked out. The hallway was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the Christmas tree. I stopped for a moment, looking at it, the same tree we decorated as kids, full of ornaments that told lies about a happy family. I could still hear faint voices from the dining room behind me. My mother's sobbing, my father's low rumble of shame, Ethan's muffled rage. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a release. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, covering the driveway, the hedges, the world. I stepped onto the porch, wrapping my shawl around my shoulders. The air was cold enough to sting, sharp enough to make me feel alive. Maggie was standing by the door, her coat on. She looked at me, her eyes soft. "You did it," she said quietly. "I did," I said. "It's done." She studied my face for a long moment. "How does it feel?" I thought about it. The silence inside. "The truth is finally out." The weight lifted but not gone, like I finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. Maggie nodded. "Then breathe, sweetheart. You've earned it." I looked back at the house one last time. The mansion glowing like a snow globe, perfect and fragile from the outside, shattered within. Then I stepped into the falling snow, my heels crunching softly against the frozen ground. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward it. The morning after the Christmas dinner was silent in the Pierce mansion. Not peaceful, just hollow like a stage after the audience has gone home. The garlands were still perfect, the candles burned low, but everything that had held the illusion together had cracked. I woke early, the kind of early that comes from adrenaline, not rest. Downstairs, the faint smell of pine and burnt sugar lingered from last night's desserts. I could hear the creak of footsteps, Ethan's heavy and restless. When I entered the dining room, he was already there, still in his suit from the night before, tie-loosened eyes bloodshot. He looked smaller somehow, like someone had taken the air out of him. You ruined everything, he said without turning around. His voice was hoarse, quiet, and dangerous. I revealed the truth, I said. He spun to face me. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You destroyed our family's reputation. For what? To prove a point, I walked to the window, watching the pale winter light filter through the frost. It wasn't about a point. It was about the truth, finally having a voice. He slammed his hand on the table. You've made a fool out of me, Nat. Do you even know what the press will say? Do you know what this means for Pierce Holdings? Yes, I said calmly. It means accountability. He laughed, bitter and sharp. You think this makes you some kind of savior? You're just playing a power game you don't understand. Ethan, I said, turning to face him, I understand it better than you ever did. The difference is, I didn't need to crush people to win it. For a second, I thought he might hit something or someone. His fists clenched, then slowly loosened. He dropped into a chair, staring at the untouched plates from last night's feast. You were supposed to be the good one, he said, his voice cracking. The quiet one. I was, I said softly, until you turned quiet into invisible. He laughed again, but there was no humor in it. You've got what you wanted. Congratulations, boss. He spat the word like poison. What happens now? Now, I said, we rebuilt the company properly. No fake charities, no personal jets, no bribed board votes. The audit will start Monday. He looked up sharply. You can't be serious. I'm always serious. His jaw tightened. You're going to take everything from me. I already took it, I said. Now I'm just deciding what to do with it. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint tick of the grandfather clock. Then his voice came low and venomous. You've always hated me. I never hated you, I said. I pitied you. You spent your life chasing our father's shadow, and the one time you could have stood on your own, you chose to stand on my work instead. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the table, on the scattered crumbs of last night's perfection. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mom appeared, still in her silk robe, mascara smudged. She looked between us like she was walking into a crime scene. Is it true? She asked quietly. Everything you said last night. Yes, I said. Her hand went to her chest. 70% through Evercrest Capital, legally and publicly. She sank into a chair, trembling. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never listened, I said simply. If I'd told you 6 years ago, you'd have laughed. Just like you did last night. Her eyes filled with tears. We thought you were lost. I was, I said. But not in the way you think. Dad entered then, his posture still proud, but his face lined with something I'd never seen before, shame. Your mother didn't sleep, he said. None of us did. I'm not surprised. He studied me for a long moment. You've made your point. It's not a point, Dad. It's a reckoning. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold light. You've won, Natalie. You've proven you're smarter, stronger, richer. Is that what you wanted? I shook my head. No. I wanted you to see me, to finally understand that I wasn't the failure you made me out to be. Mom's voice broke. You've destroyed this family. I turned to her. No, Mom. You destroyed it when you decided that success was the only kind of love worth giving. She started to cry softly. Dad put a hand on her shoulder, but his eyes stayed on me, hard, unyielding, maybe even afraid. Finally, he said, You may own the company, but you'll never have the family. I met his gaze evenly. Then maybe I never had one to begin with. The silence after that was unbearable. I picked up my coat from the chair and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Mom asked through her tears. "Home," I said, "wherever that ends up being." Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world covered in clean white stillness. The sun was rising pale and weak, but it was enough. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A message from Victoria. Audit documents finalized. Press already asking for statements. "Do you want to respond publicly?" I typed back. "Not yet. Let the truth speak for itself first." I slipped the phone into my coat pocket and stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air. My breath came out in soft clouds like ghosts leaving my body. The front door opened behind me. Ethan stepped out, coatless, shivering, but still proud. "You think this is over?" he called out. I looked back at him. "For you, maybe. For me, it's just the beginning." He laughed bitterly. "You'll be alone. You know that, right? Better alone than owned." He shook his head, retreating back into the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed across the empty driveway. I stood there for a long time, staring at the mansion, its walls gleaming, its windows frosted, its beauty as hollow as the people inside. Then I got into my car and drove away. The road was slick with ice, but the sky ahead was clearing, streaks of pink and gold cutting through the gray. The world looked cleaner somehow, sharper, like it had been stripped of illusion. As the mansion disappeared in the rearview mirror, I whispered to myself, "Let them rebuild their lies. I'll rebuild my life." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like defiance. They felt like freedom. By Monday morning, the story had already broken. "Anonymous majority shareholder exposes corruption at Pierce Holdings," read the headline on Bloomberg. Below it, a photo of my brother and father at last year's charity gala, smiling, confident, untouchable. The article detailed the internal audit I'd initiated through Evercrest Capital, citing unexplained expenditures, nepotism, and misuse of corporate funds. Victoria called just after 6 a.m. "You're on every major outlet," she said. Wall Street Journal, Reuters, CNBC. The board's panicking. Ethan's office line has been disconnected. I sat by my kitchen window, coffee steaming in my hands, the city outside waking under a thin veil of snow. "Let it burn," I said. "You know this is going to get ugly, right? I'm counting on it." I watched my breath fog the cold window pane. The headlines were exactly what I had planned: clinical, devastating, undeniable. But seeing my father's and Ethan's faces plastered beneath the word corruption didn't bring the pure satisfaction I'd rehearsed. It felt heavy, like I was holding a mirror up to the family and shattering it, not just for them, but for the little girl inside me who once desperately wanted their approval. This wasn't just corporate strategy. It was an amputation, painful and necessary. By 8:30, my inbox was in chaos. Board members begging for clarification, employees forwarding screenshots of internal messages, journalists asking for statements. I ignored them all. For once, silence was power. At 9 on the dot, my phone buzzed again, this time a text from Ethan. "Ethan, you did this? Me. No, you did. Ethan, you've destroyed everything. Me." Then it wasn't built to last. An hour later, Victoria sent a new message, security footage from headquarters. "You'll want to see this." She attached a clip. Ethan, pale and sweating, storming through the glass lobby of Pierce Holdings, shouting into his phone while security guards hovered uncertainly nearby. Behind him, a crowd of employees watched. A few were filming. The scene ended with him slamming his access badge onto the front desk and shoving through the revolving doors. By noon, it was on Twitter. By 1, it was trending. #Pierce meltdown. I didn't post a single word. I didn't have to. The next day, the audit results went public: unauthorized company credit cards, luxury vacations disguised as business trips, consulting fees paid to non-existent firms. Vanessa's name appeared twice, tied to marketing initiatives that had no paper trail. The SEC opened an inquiry before the day was over. Dad called that evening. His voice was low, ragged. "You've made a spectacle of us." "I didn't need to," I said. "You did that yourselves." "This isn't justice, Natalie. This is vengeance." "Sometimes they look the same," I said, and hung up. The third day brought chaos. The Pierce Holdings stock dropped 40% by midday. Reporters camped outside the headquarters shouting questions at employees. Someone leaked internal emails confirming the board had voted to remove Ethan as CEO. My name, Evercrest's name, was now synonymous with control. By Thursday, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, lawyers, even former classmates I hadn't heard from in a decade, all pretending they'd believed in me all along. Then around 5, Victoria called again. The board wants to meet you tomorrow. Emergency session. They're terrified. You'll have every vote you need. Then book it, I said. Public or private, I thought about it for a long moment, watching snow fall outside my window, slow and deliberate. Public. Let the world watch what accountability looks like. The next morning, the Pierce Holdings boardroom felt colder than I remembered. 12 men sat around the long mahogany table, their expensive watches and perfect suits doing nothing to hide their fear. James Holloway. The interim chair cleared his throat. Ms. Pierce, thank you for coming. We understand you now hold a controlling interest in the company. I do, I said. He shifted uneasily. We were unaware of your, arrangements with Evercrest. Your lack of awareness, I said evenly, is exactly why I'm here. Murmurs rippled around the room. One man coughed, another avoided eye contact. I set a stack of papers on the table, copies of the audit report, clean and brutal. You've all benefited from corruption. You've ignored ethics for profit. That ends today. Holloway bristled. You can't just walk in here and dismantle decades of structure. Watch me. The room went still. Victoria, seated beside me, began distributing folders. Effective immediately, the following executives are under investigation for financial misconduct. The board will appoint an interim leadership team under Ms. Pierce's supervision. One man, Bennett the CFO, stood abruptly. You can't run this company alone. You don't know the first thing about corporate governance. I looked him straight in the eye. I know enough to recognize theft when I see it. Sit down, Bennett. He did. By the end of the meeting, I'd accepted the board's unanimous vote confirming me as executive chairwoman of Pierce Holdings. The irony wasn't lost on me, the title they once denied me, now delivered with trembling hands. When it was over, Victoria and I walked out together, our footsteps echoing in the marble hall. You did it, she said quietly. No, I said. They did. I just stopped pretending not to notice. Outside, cameras flashed as soon as I stepped through the revolving doors. Questions flew, Ms. Pierce. Did you plan this takeover? Was your brother involved in fraud? What's next for Pierce Holdings? I paused on the steps, letting the wind bite my face. My only comment, I said, is that the truth always finds its way to daylight. Then I turned and walked toward the waiting car. By nightfall, the footage of that moment was everywhere. The image of me standing under the gray Boston sky, calm, poised, unapologetic, circulated across social media with 1,000 different captions. From family failure to corporate queen. The woman who owned her brother. The rise of Natalie Pierce. Victoria texted me a screenshot of one post that had gone viral. You've become the story, she wrote. Maybe. But stories have costs. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the city glittering beyond the windows, the hum of traffic like distant applause. My phone buzzed with messages, praise, outrage, offers. I turned it off and poured myself a glass of wine. For years I'd been invisible. Now the world couldn't stop looking at me. The victory was real, but it was heavy. Somewhere deep down beneath the adrenaline and the satisfaction, I could still hear Ethan's voice echoing from the night of the dinner. You'll be alone. Maybe he was right. Maybe power always came with isolation. I took a slow sip of wine, staring at the skyline reflected in the glass. For the first time, I wondered if revenge was ever supposed to feel this quiet. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, steady, relentless. And I realized the storm I'd unleashed wasn't over. It had only just begun. The first snowfall of January came quietly without warning. From my office window, the city looked like a painting, white rooftops, blurred headlights, the hum of life muffled by snow. Inside, everything was warm, ordered, and efficient. My assistant moved through the office like a shadow, answering calls and scheduling interviews for the next quarter. On paper, Pierce Holdings was thriving again. The market had stabilized, the public trusted the new leadership, and employees finally felt safe speaking up. But inside me, there was only silence. It had been nearly a month since I'd last spoken to anyone in my family. My father hadn't called again, my mother had retreated into her private sorrow, and Ethan had vanished completely. No phone calls, no interviews, not even a trace on social media. Victoria said that was good. Let him fade, she told me. Let the old world die so you can build the new one. But at night, when the office lights went dark, and I was left alone with my thoughts, I still saw his face from that Christmas dinner, the shock, the anger, the betrayal. Sometimes revenge doesn't end a war. It just changes who's holding the sword. That afternoon, I attended a press conference to announce the company's new foundation, a program funding education for women in finance. The cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Ms. Pierce, do you believe your leadership is a statement about gender equality? One reporter asked. I smiled politely. It's not about gender, I said. It's about merit. It's about earning a seat at the table, even when the door's been locked for years. Applause rippled through the crowd, but I barely heard it. The words came easily now, too easily. They were armor. Afterward, I returned to my apartment exhausted. The city glowed beneath me, a constellation of ambition and regret. I poured a glass of scotch and stood by the window watching the snow fall heavier. The modern office felt sterile, a vast landscape of glass and emptiness when the last employee left. I realized the silence I craved years ago had become a new form of burden, the silence of isolation. It was just me, the city lights, and the heavy awareness that winning the Pierce empire had cost me the last remnants of my family. My phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Mom. I hesitated before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice came softly careful, like she was approaching a wounded animal. Hi, Mom. I know it's late, she said, but I thought maybe we could talk. Your father's not here. He's out of town. Her voice cracked on the last words. I read about the foundation, she continued. It's wonderful, Natalie. You're doing something good with all this. Trying to, I said quietly. There was a long pause. Then she whispered, Your brother called me last week. I froze. Ethan, yes. He said he's staying somewhere in Vermont. He sounded lost, angry, but not at you exactly, at himself. I didn't answer. He asked about you, she said. He said he wanted to know if you were happy. I laughed softly, though it sounded hollow. Happy? I don't even know what that means anymore. Natalie, she said gently, you got what you wanted. You proved yourself. But proving something and finding peace aren't the same thing. Her words hit harder than I expected. Come home, she whispered, even just for dinner. Please. I looked out at the snow, the city lights fading beneath a white blur. Home. The word didn't feel real anymore. I'll think about it, I said, though we both knew I wouldn't. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, watching the snow pile against the glass. The world looked clean. I knew better. Snow just hides the dirt until it melts. 3 days later, an email arrived in my personal inbox. No subject line, no sender name, just a single sentence. You took everything from me. Now I'll take it back. Ethan. My stomach dropped. For a long time, I just stared at the screen, rereading the words until they blurred. Victoria found me still sitting there when she walked in. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. I handed her the phone. It's from him. Her eyes flicked across the message. It could be empty talk. He's angry, humiliated. He's dangerous, I said quietly. He's always been dangerous when he's desperate. She frowned. I'll have security check the building, just in case. But that night as I lay awake, I kept hearing the echo of his voice from years ago when we were just kids, his laughter when he beat me at chess, his smug grin when Dad praised him at dinner. He'd always needed to win, and now he'd lost everything. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. My assistant met me at the door, pale and nervous. Ms. Pierce, She said someone's been here. What do you mean, in your office? There was a note. I walked past her, heart pounding, and saw it on my desk, a single piece of paper folded once. In Ethan's handwriting, "You can't deny family." No signature, no threat, just that. Victoria called the police, of course. Security cameras showed nothing. No signs of forced entry. It was like the ghost of my brother had simply slipped through the cracks of my new empire. But that night when I left the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The streets were quiet, the air sharp and cold. My driver opened the car door, but I paused, looking back at the dark windows above. Somewhere in that glass and steel tower, the past was still alive, waiting, haunting, unfinished. I got into the car, shutting the door behind me. "Home, Ms. Pierce?" the driver asked. I looked out at the snow swirling under the streetlights. "No," I said softly. "Not yet." And as the car pulled away, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since that Christmas dinner. The real reckoning hadn't happened yet. It was coming. And this time, it wouldn't wait until the holidays. The message came at dawn. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, slicing through the quiet of my apartment. The number was blocked. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Natalie." It was his voice, tired, frayed, but unmistakable. "Ethan." I didn't speak. "I need to see you," he said. "One last time." My pulse quickened. "Where are you?" "At the lake house," he said. "Dad's old place." "Don't bring anyone." Then the line went dead. For a long moment I just sat there, staring out at the pale light spilling over the city skyline. The lake house. The one place I swore I'd never go back to. It was where we'd spent every summer as kids before money and ambition poisoned everything. The place where Dad taught Ethan how to fish, and where I learned how to disappear. By the time I reached the outskirts of the property, the snow had stopped. The long drive was lined with frost-bitten pines, their branches heavy with silence. The house stood at the end, dark against the gray sky, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. He was waiting for me inside, sitting by the old fireplace. The flames threw long, uneven shadows across his face. He looked older, haunted even, but the sharpness in his eyes was still there. "You came?" he said, almost surprised. "You didn't leave me much of a choice." He smirked. Still dramatic as ever. I took off my gloves and set them on the table. "You sent threats broken to my office. I had to see what you wanted." "That wasn't a threat," he said quietly. "It was a warning." "Of what?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You think you've won, but all you've done is become the thing you swore you'd never be." I laughed, bitter and sharp. "And what's that, Dad?" The word hit harder than I expected. "You built your empire on power, control, and humiliation," he said. "You took everything from me the same way he took everything from you." "I took back what was mine," I said. He shook his head. "You just changed the locks on the same prison." I turned away, staring at the fire. "If you called me here for therapy, I'm leaving." He stood suddenly. "You don't get it, do you? None of this was ever about money. It was about who got to matter, who got to exist." His voice broke on that last word. I looked at him, then really looked. His eyes were red, his hands trembling. He wasn't the arrogant golden son anymore. He was just a man stripped bare. "Ethan," I said quietly, "what do you want from me?" He exhaled shakily. "An apology." The silence stretched brittle and sharp. "For what?" I asked. "For turning me into the villain," he said. "For making the world believe I was the monster. You think I didn't know what Dad was doing all those years? You think I didn't feel it when he compared us? When he made me his weapon against you, my throat tightened. I didn't ask for this," he said. "I just didn't know how to stop it. So I played the part. And by the time I realized what it had cost, it was too late." He looked up, and for the first time since we were kids, his voice softened. "You were the only one who ever scared him, you know. That's why he pushed you down. Because he saw what you could be." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly between us, the only thing still alive in that house full of ghosts. "I didn't mean to destroy you," I said finally. "But I couldn't keep being the one they laughed at." "I know." He stepped closer. "And I didn't mean to destroy you either." There it was, mutual ruin dressed as understanding. He reached into his coat pocket and I stiffened. But when he pulled his hand out, he was holding a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, "is my resignation. From everything. The company, the trust, the inheritance. It's yours." I stared at it stunned. "Why?" "Because I'm tired," he said. "And because you were right. You built it. You earned it. I just want out." I took the paper slowly. His handwriting was shaky but clear. Ethan Pierce, signature date finality. "What will you do?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Disappear, maybe. Start over. Find out who I am without our father's voice in my head." He walked to the window, looking out at the frozen lake. "Do you remember the winter we fell through the ice?" he asked. I nodded. "You pulled me out." He glanced back at me. "Maybe this is me doing it again." The fire popped, scattering embers across the hearth. I felt the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on the room. Years of resentment, pride, pain melting into something fragile, something almost like forgiveness. He turned to leave, pausing by the doorway. "You got what you wanted, Nat. Don't let it turn you into him." And then he was gone. I stood there long after the sound of his car faded down the icy road. The fire burned lower, the air colder. When I finally stepped outside, the world was silent again, clean white and waiting. By the time I reached the city that night, the resignation letter sat on the passenger seat beside me. I could have filed it immediately, made the takeover complete. But instead I folded it back into my coat pocket. For once, power didn't feel like victory. It felt like inheritance, a crown passed down through blood and regret. Back in my office, I poured a drink and stood by the window. The skyline glittered unfeeling and perfect. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe I had become what I hated. But as the city lights blurred through the glass, I realized something else. Revenge had never been the end of my story. It was just the part where I stopped being afraid to write the rest. I raised my glass to the reflection staring back at me, strong, flawed, unbreakable. To endings, I whispered, and to start again. The snow began to fall once more, soft and endless, covering everything that came before. The morning of the Aurora Initiative's first anniversary dawned with that kind of rare clarity that feels like a promise. The city was bathed in soft gold light, the air still crisp from the rain the night before. From the balcony of my townhouse, I could see the skyline, gleaming buildings catching the sunrise like mirrors reflecting 1,000 beginnings. I stood there with my coffee, watching it all unfold, the hum of the world below steady and certain. Behind me, Michael was wrapping gifts in brown paper at the dining table. "You know," he said, not looking up for someone who used to swear she'd never do public events again, "you've been to 3 this month." I smiled. "I'm not doing it for the cameras. I'm doing it for the people who were like me, once working in silence, convinced no one would ever notice." He tied the string around the last box and glanced up. "And today's the big one, huh? Today's the full circle." The Aurora offices were already buzzing by the time I arrived. Balloons floated near the ceiling, and someone had hung a banner that read, "1 year of light." Ethan was in the corner helping volunteers set up the donation table, laughing as he balanced a tray of cupcakes. Dean stood near the entrance, deep in conversation with a group of investors, his expression proud but calm. When he saw me, he broke away and smiled. "We did it," he said. "We did," I replied. The celebration wasn't glamorous, no flashing lights, no red carpet. It had none of the brittle perfection of a high society wedding. Just people. The kind of people who made the work matter, single mothers who'd started businesses, young women who'd found their footing again, older professionals who'd refused to give up. The room buzzed with laughter music and the hum of stories being rewritten. At noon, Dean stepped up to the microphone. "1 year ago," he began, "we stood in an empty office with nothing but an idea and a handful of stubborn people who believed success could look different. Today, that idea has funded over 50 projects, created hundreds of jobs, and changed lives in ways numbers can't measure. But none of it would exist without one woman's vision, Natalie Pierce. The applause hit like a wave. I felt my face flush as I stepped onto the small stage. "Thank you," I said once it quieted. But this was never about me. It was about all of you. About every person who refused to let failure be their final definition. I took a breath, steadying myself. A year ago, I stood in a ballroom while my own brother mocked me for clipping coupons. I let him because I knew something he didn't, that patience compounds faster than arrogance ever will. Today, I stand here surrounded by proof. Proof that light grows stronger in quiet hands. Ethan was watching from the front row, pride softening his smile. When our eyes met, I saw no trace of the man who'd once measured worth in status, only gratitude. After the speeches, people mingled. A reporter from Bloomberg approached me, recorder in hand. "What's next for Aurora?" she asked. "Expansion," I said. "We're launching mentorship programs in 5 new states, and a digital platform so people who can't reach us physically can still find guidance. Think of it as SEO for the soul, helping people optimize their own potential." She laughed. "That's the best tagline I've heard in years." "It's true," I said, smiling. "Sometimes you just need a little search and a lot of self-optimization." Later, when the crowd began to thin, Ethan found me by the windows. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," he said. He led me toward a small group near the back. A young woman stood there, clutching a folder to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 22. "Ms. Pierce," she said shyly, "I'm studying finance at Oregon State. My mom was one of the first Aurora recipients. She started a bookkeeping business last year. She says your program gave her life back. I just wanted to say thank you." My throat tightened. "You don't owe me thanks. Just keep building." She smiled. "I will." "She told me something you said, that success doesn't have to be loud to be real." I nodded. She's right. When the event ended, I lingered as everyone began to leave. The balloons swayed above me and sunlight poured through the glass, pooling on the floor like liquid gold. Dean joined me quietly. "You know," he said, "the board offered to rename the initiative after you." I turned to him, shaking my head. "Aurora belongs to everyone. I built it to outlive my name." He studied me for a moment, then smiled. "You've changed more than companies, Natalie. You've changed definitions." I looked around the room one last time. "Maybe," I said softly, "but I think the real change is seeing people believe they deserve to start again." That evening, after everyone had gone, I drove out to the coast. The same stretch of cliffs where Ethan's wedding had taken place 2 years before. The estate was quiet now, its windows dark, the waves crashing below. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind whip my hair, remembering the sound of laughter, the sting of humiliation, the moment Dean's voice cut through the noise and changed everything. I whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the universe for the long, painful, necessary symmetry of it all. When I got home, the house was warm and full of light. Michael was waiting on the couch, reading a glass of wine beside him. I joined him, curling up against his side. "How was it?" he asked. "Perfect," I said. Not loud. Just right. We sat there in silence, the kind that feels earned. On the table beside the lamp sat the small stone Ethan had given me months ago, the one etched with the word grace. I reached out and turned it over, tracing the letters with my thumb. Michael smiled. "Still your favorite word, always," I said. Outside, the rain began to fall, softly tapping against the windows like applause fading into quiet. I thought of every version of myself that had existed before this ambitious, wounded, invisible, and how each one had built the next. Revenge had started it, but redemption had finished it. And somewhere between the two, I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for. Peace. I looked up at the ceiling and exhaled. "If you're listening," I murmured to the air, "I hope you know this was never about payback. It was about balance." The wind outside shifted, carrying the faint scent of salt and new beginnings. And for the first time since that fateful wedding, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I just felt free. If this story reminded you that power without peace is empty, don't forget to like this video and share your own story of rising from the ashes in the comments below. Let's redefine what winning truly means.